Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Research America webinar. We are just so thrilled to have you join us. And thank you to those of you who are Research America Alliance members for your partnership in our alliance. If your organization is not a member, please join us. My colleague Anna Platt would be more than happy to connect with you to discuss the value of being Research America Alliance member. And I have to say that your membership brings a lot of value to the Alliance in terms of our ability to advocate on issues like some that we'll be talking about today and others relevant to faster medical and public health progress. So Anna's email is in the chat, and that is the end of my pitch. Today, I am so thrilled to introduce my friend and colleague, Paul Kim. He is a partner at Foley Hoag, a law firm. He's a top expert on all things FDA and CMS. And Paul is going to speak with us today about the intersection of the FDA approval process and the CMS coverage process. As you all know, this has really been a dual issue that's been spotlighted recently with decisions on accelerated approval at FDA and CMS coverage of medicines approved through the accelerated approval process. And it also goes to Medicaid coverage. So as always, please type your questions into the Q&A box or chat, and we will do our best to pose them when we get to the Q&A portion of today's session. And with that, let me turn to you, Paul.
Thank you, Ellie. It is great to be here. Great to be joining you all. I'm really pleased to be talking about this subject. It's close to my heart, so you'll probably need to shut me up before we run out of time. We've got, I think, 9 slides, maybe. I'm not gonna read them. We're gonna go through them pretty quickly. You know, this is very high level, of course, and I know much of this will be extremely familiar to all of you because you're so well engaged in the process of discovery, life science discovery, and innovation in the US. So forgive me if this stuff is a little ABC, but let's start from level setting ourselves and then talk a little bit more in detail about accelerated approval, as Ellie had mentioned, and also coverage with evidence development over at CMS, which are permutations of what you see here on the slide. So here are the two agencies. They have different statutory responsibilities and mandates. They have different requirements. They do different things. But, you know, as you know, they are sister federal agencies housed within the Department of Health and Human Services. They share a mission of advancing public health, albeit in their different domains. So we're going to talk about what does the statute tell each agency to do and how do they put that into practice. So let's start with the FDA, just in terms of process, right? This is how products get to market. The Agency for Drugs and Biological Products, and we're going to limit our conversation today to drugs and biological products, not to medical devices or diagnostics. The agency has to show, or I should say the sponsor has to show to the FDA that for a drug to be approved for marketing in the US, the drug has to be effective for its proposed labeled use, and it has to be safe. Its expected benefits outweigh its potential risks. So what does that mean? So in terms of effectiveness, what the agency is told to do by Congress through the statute is that you must show substantial evidence, right, that the drug works as intended. Substantial evidence, and this is magic language. I bolded the language that comes out of the statute. So if we ever need to look back and find the sites, we can actually share them with you. Substantial evidence under the regs means adequate and well-controlled investigations. That includes clinical investigations. So historically, since the CFAR amendments were passed in the 60s, that meant 2 adequate and well-controlled clinical trials. Historically, that has evolved. And I believe, Ellie, I think it was in 2012 we did this. We put into statute that, okay, substantial evidence can be 1 adequate and well-controlled clinical trial with confirmatory evidence. So 1 plus. And that is the statutory standard today to prove that something has benefits, is effective as demonstrated. On the other hand, you know, once you get to market and your BLA or NDA is approved, so CMS operates under the Social Security Act. You'll find the statutes in black at the bottom. Completely different statutory standard. For purposes of Medicare coverage, let's talk about what standard does CMS think about. The standard under the law is reasonable and necessary. And the language itself is reasonable and necessary for the diagnosis, treatment of illness. There's more language after that, actually. It's or to improve the functioning of a malformed body member, which tells you that this statute was written a long time ago. So, but you get the gist of like, what is it they're looking for? Now, outside of the statute, what CMS has historically interpreted reasonable and necessary to mean for services or products, they look for evidence that the item or the service improves health outcomes. That is not extrajudicial, that is outside of the statute. It is something that's through practice policy. It is not in regulation, it is not in statute. So I just want you guys to know this is what CMS is interpreting and what it wants when it deems something eligible and appropriate for Medicare coverage. The gold stuff down here, let's talk about the processes, okay? We talk about the standards. At the FDA, as you know, upon submission of an NDA or BLA, the agency has to will typically go to an advisory committee for advice. And under the statute, the agency is not obliged to listen to the advisory committee, right? It can reach a different conclusion. But more often than not, it will call for an advisory committee to tell it about a new molecular entity, something that's new under the sun. We talked about what trials are obliged to be fulfilled, submitted by the sponsor to demonstrate safety and effectiveness. And we've said that it can be 1+. Over at the CMS side, what we do know is that the agency doesn't have as transparent a process, really. What's really interesting is that there are so many products and services that come into CMS for under claims, but also for potential coverage determinations. And more often than not, the agency delegates. So historically, when a drug is approved by FDA, it will get covered. That has been sort of the historic trend if you look back since the 1960s and creation of the statutory language. And then the agency, CMS, has a couple of options. It can defer to the regional MACs, which are the contractors that administer different regions of the country with potentially disparate outcomes and inconsistencies. It can do a national coverage determination, NCD, but given the staffing and the resources the agency has, it can only do this for a small fraction of those many technologies, drugs, devices, services that get flowing into CMS for potential coverage. And finally, it can determine that it won't cover something, and that has happened, but it has to do so on an evidence base. So there's, in rough format and shape, the standards on which the FDA and CMS operate for getting a drug to market is safe and effective, for coverage for Medicare, and sort of some of the procedural hallmarks and milestones that we see at both agencies. Let's go to the next slide quickly. We're going to talk a little bit now about a variant of what has been called traditional approval, right? Which is where you get a full-blown NDA or BLA, it's submitted, you have maybe one, maybe two pivotal trials. What we're talking about here is accelerated approval. And Ellie, you've made the point that this is something that has been on the books at the agency for a long time. It arose out of HIV. The first approval under accelerated approval was AZT on the basis of a surrogate endpoint. And by that, I mean not a direct measure of clinical benefit. That's what a surrogate endpoint is. And there are surrogate endpoints or biomarkers or endpoints for many, all disease states and conditions, right? And the only question is how robust is the data to substantiate use of that surrogate to get an approval? What the statute tells us, and the way that Congress has written it and the way that the agencies put into practice is accelerated approval is full approval, right? It's not a conditional approval. It's not tentative approval. In fact, if I remember correctly, in January, Rick Pazder, who's head of the Oncology Center at FDA, he actually wrote a piece in JAMA Oncology called, and I think this is the actual title, Accelerated Approval is not conditional approval. I mean, you can't be more direct than that. It is a full approval for purposes of the law. But given what evidence is brought to bear by the sponsor under accelerated approval, it may not be the totality of evidence you'd find in an otherwise traditional submission. So what does that mean? It means that the FDA then asks the sponsor to confirm benefit and confirm effectiveness under a post-market regime by conducting post-market studies to verify that the thing actually works as it is intended. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll show you the actual language. This is what the statute says. This is how the agency promulgated this 92 final rule, which was then enshrined in law. right? Treats a serious or life-threatening condition. Meaningful advantage over existing therapy. This is a very important criterion. And finally, the magic language about surrogacy, surrogate endpoint. This is not a direct measure of clinical benefit. This is something that is reasonably likely. Actually, I put that in bold, reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. This is a very flexible standard, right? It says that there is something not conclusive about the evidentiary base of effectiveness, and yet the agency will take this and, giving this flexible authority, get a drug to market faster and give patients access to it faster, where there's unmet medical need, right? Where there is a potential for meaningful difference with existing therapeutic options. So this is the magic of accelerated approval. There are other expedited review pathways to get to market, but accelerated approval was the first, and it is meaningful. And to date, I believe the agency has used it for 250 different drugs and biological products, a not inconsequential amount of product experience. And I will just say for the moment, to give you guys a sense of baseline, about, I believe 40% of the drugs under accelerated approval are for HIV/AIDS. About a third of them are cancer, and that is increasing over time. It is increasingly a pathway for cancer drugs. And about a quarter of them, I believe, are for non-oncological genetic disorders, so about rare diseases that are not cancer in nature. So that's the totality of product that's gotten to market. Well, what is the pathway done for those drugs and for those patients? By one measure, in the Journal of NCI, I think from about 10 years ago, they estimated that the pathway saved about 4.5 to 5 years for oncolytics, for cancer drugs to get to market, a not insubstantial difference from what we would call a traditional approval, right? So that's accelerated approval. I hope that's a good nutshell for you all. Let's jump to the next slide. Go over to the divide to the other agency. And as you know, CMS, its ambit, as Ellie, you mentioned, covers the landscape for federal payors, right? For federal health programs. Medicare, across the board, Part A in hospitals, Part B in medical benefit, Part D in drugs, and of course, Medicaid, the 50 states that cooperate in financing Medicaid for many beneficiaries. The only thing I want to point out here is that the reasonable necessary language we've been talking about is in relation to parts A and B of Medicare. So it's not the standard for Medicaid, is not the Part D standard, but it is one that is operative for Part A and B. Let's go to the next slide. So what does this language mean? We talked about this. Let's break this out in greater detail. The statutory language we've kept here on the left in those blocks, right? Diagnosis, treatment of illness or injury, or the malformed body parts. We'll dispense with that for the moment. But this is what CMS means when they say reasonable necessary. Safe and effective, not investigational, appropriate, including duration and frequency. And then that fourth bullet, again, I want to emphasize, this is not in the statute. This is not in regulation, but this is practice where the agency undertaking coverage determinations, including NCDs, this is the language that it uses frequently. Let's go to the next slide. So we talked about the regional MACs. So the agency itself could do an NCD and determine whether something is reasonable necessary, or can defer to the MACs to make these regional determinations. And again, you'll see where they are. These are contractors. They may reach different determinations. The outcomes may be very different if you're in California versus in Maine. Next slide. Now, when they do a national coverage determination, they could simply take the evidence as presented. Anybody can ask for a national coverage determination. You can come in with a petition and ask for them to take this on. But because of resource limitations, right, they can only do it for a small fraction of potential new products or technologies. So one way that the agency can do a national coverage determination is covered with evidence development, CED. What does that mean? So it means that it will grant coverage contingent on the completion of something else, additional studies, the development of new data. So this has been in place. Really, it's a recent innovation by the agency by historic measures since 2005 when they promulgated their standards, and they've only used it in a few cases. I've listed a few here, including notably PET scans for the clinical evaluation of Alzheimer's patients in their amyloid burden. And how do they ask the sponsors to generate this data? They do it through randomized controlled trials, RCTs, patient registries, observed data, so claims data also. But typically what they're looking for is new prospective data that has sort of a high level of rigor. So this is a substantial burden, if you will, but they do this because they believe that the evidence to date isn't sufficient to actually determine that that product is reasonable necessary. They want to close the proposition, they want to get the conclusive evidence, and so they ask them to do more. I'll also point out that in addition to that, part of the authority that the agency relies on to actually do CED is a research authority, that they're actually enfranchised to actually ask questions like this. And questions about whether they can do it or not have been brought to bear. People question whether the agency has such authority to do CED, and the agency thinks it does. Let's go to the next slide. This is the process in very bare bones. You'll see that it can take quite a long time. What you don't see here in this iterative, public, and transparent process, right, where you have review and you have public comment, is that the length of time to actually complete the development of this evidence, to complete the trial, to establish the patient registry, to accrue the data, can be years. So we're not looking at a short-term process. We're looking at something that is at least comparable to the development programs that precede filing of pre-market submissions at FDA. Let's go to the next slide real quick. So we've talked about the different domains that the FDA and the CMS oversee respectively to get to market, to get covered for Medicare. And we talked about the different statutes, the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act and Public Health Service Act on one side, Social Security Act on the other. But even now we have a lot of interest in whether the agencies do a sufficient job of communicating with each other, especially for novel therapies, new under the sun treatments, things that are really potentially breakthrough. This is just an excerpt from one of the provisions of Cures 2.0. Ellie, I know this is very familiar to you as well. If you look at this language, it says, like, for breakthrough, fast track, accelerated approval products, what this provision would ask FDA and CMS to do is to talk more. You can see the actual magic language here. Maintain communication, share such information, inform and coordinate your respective decisions. And the only thing I will comment on is this is clearly intended to be beneficial, right? This is intended to facilitate communication, to remove disparities in outcomes, to harmonize data requirements, hopefully, and actually streamline things. But I would say that this could always be a double-edged sword in practice, right? That these agencies do have their individual domains. They have their statutory requirements. They interpret them differently. And so as you attempt to harmonize, the question is, does one domain bleed over into the other? Do you inadvertently increase barriers or increase time or increase the evidentiary burdens on sponsors to even get to market, as a consequence of this communication where you intended to do otherwise? It's possible. I think that's the only conclusion we can reach, that it's possible it could be a bad thing as well as a good thing. But just to note that, this is an active conversation and that there is interest in trying to have the agencies talk. I will say, Ellie, actually, you may find this funny. I remember about 20 years ago, I was in a meeting between the CMS coverage staff at Medicare and CDRH, right, the device folks, but they both said this was the first time they had actually met with each other. So I think, it's actually, I was really struck by that. But so I think from about 20 years on, we're seeing increased communication and collaboration, obviously, right, including the MCIT rule that was proposed and then withdrawn last year. But nevertheless, this is still relatively new under the sun for these agencies. Let me just shut up there and just stop. And Ellie, I'm happy to take questions, but also would love to have a conversation with you about.
Yeah, no, I am going to take a few minutes with you before we go to questions. I'm just so interested in this. I think the last point you made is really important, because one of the things that's striking here is that the Food and Drug Administration is the agency responsible for assessing both safety and efficacy, so value to the patient. And yet, when CMS requires research, they are ostensibly assessing value to the patient. And they're doing that under an interpretation, I think you said, of the law that the products that they will cover must deliver clinical benefit. And the implicit message is FDA got it. To me, I could be getting this wrong, but that they're disagreeing with FDA's regulatory approval of a medicine. They're not saying there wasn't sufficient testing on the age group we're covering even, right? When they have used CED, it is basically, we need more evidence that there's clinical benefit. Am I getting that right?
I mean, I think there are different reasons why they might reach different conclusions, right? With that, CMS will ask for something other than or different from what the sponsor has already provided, right? Under an NDA
Right.
or BLA. Yeah, and I think part of it also is like, right, well, look, we're looking at the over 65 or disabled population eligible for Medicare, right? The Medicare beneficiaries, are they the same population as under the label? The label may be for everybody except maybe the pediatric population, right? So it's like,
Right.
So you're right, there can be real extrinsic empiric reasons why the agencies are thinking about different things or put priority on different things.
I agree with that, but I don't think, it doesn't sound like that has been, it doesn't feel like that's the reasoning. They're not using those specific other reasons in the cases that you've talked about where they've used CED for drugs. It sounds like more like, we're not so sure you got it right. I hate to be radical, but that's what it sounds like to me. And I think the point that you made is very well taken, that you've got to be very careful if you in statute say coordinate your decision-making on a medicine or a device, you're implicitly saying that CMS and FDA have the same role in determining whether there is clinical benefit for a drug and device. And instead of FDA has its role and CMS has its role. Paul, are you at liberty to discuss a specific case, the Alzheimer's drug case that has really raised a lot of questions and I'd say from some of our members' concerns on both sides? Are you at liberty to discuss that, or is that gonna put you in an odd?
I mean, I think we can talk about this as a publicly reported case of enormous importance. I think what's really great about this, and I compare this against the start of our careers, respectively, Ellie, right? The amount of information available about, not just about how the agencies made their decision, but the way they did it.
Yes.
There is an open HHS OIG investigation of the FDA review that Dr. Woodcock asked for as acting commissioner, but the AdCom is public. This has been played out in the peer review literature. I think I'd absolutely encourage folks to look at the exchange in the New England Journal, for example, where the views are, that's about as close as you can come in a peer review journal to a boxing match. You know what I mean?
Yes.
In one
Yes.
issue.
Yes.
But really at high stakes, but also an extraordinarily high level conversation, which I think was done in the public eye completely, in a complete fishbowl. And I think that's fabulous, right? Because
yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so let me just do the Cliff Notes version, and if I've got something wrong, gently put me going in the right direction. So an Alzheimer's drug was approved by FDA based on a surrogate endpoint. The surrogate endpoint was that this drug reduced amyloid plaque in the brain. And the premise was that if you reduce amyloid plaque in the brain, you improve Alzheimer's outcomes. I'm not sure if it's that, or you slow the progression of Alzheimer's. I actually am not sure which of those two or both are linked to the theory and with research behind it, but that remains controversial, that the reduction of amyloid plaque actually conveys ultimately clinical benefit to patients with Alzheimer's. And that was controversial when the decision was made to use that surrogate endpoint to approve this particular drug. I think not not in question was the fact that the drug reduced amyloid plaque. Is that accurate, or is that also in question?
So if I'm remembering correctly from the 301 and 302 studies, they showed that there was in fact a drug exposure response based on these metrics of cognitive function, memory, social functioning, and that they did see a drug dose dependent relationship and association with high dose, especially, I think, out of the two clinical trials, pivotal clinical trials. So the agency, FDA's conclusion was, okay, this is suggestive of clinical benefit. And I believe Dr. Cavzoni testified recently to the House Energy and Commerce Committee. She acknowledged again, not only in publication, but in oral testimony, that yes, the evidence was complicated and it didn't have a conclusive demonstration of effectiveness, but it did in their eyes, one, as you said, that this was a measurement that they did find in a post hoc analysis of the studies, and that was strongly suggestive that this was reasonably likely to predict clinical evidence. So the agency feels like we have the accelerated approval pathway. It's appropriate. They went to the sponsor. They're the ones who proffered this as a way to get to market, because based on the unanimous advisory committee meeting in November, the agency didn't feel like that under traditional approval that they could actually justify an approval. Instead, the reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, that using this particular surrogate, that they felt like actually this does have the hallmarks, and we can do the confirmatory study subsequently.
So that's interesting. There's a couple points there. FDA actually went to the sponsor and said the accelerated approval pathway seems appropriate because this surrogate endpoint, that is, it's what we see in these results. It's suggestive. It's not where we might be with the full approval. You're going to be required to do further studies, but we are going to give this full approval based on the accelerated approval pathway. So that's very interesting. And then FDA, CMS, they put coverage with CED, right? Coverage with evidence development.
Yeah.
And my understanding is that limits coverage to individuals who are participating in a clinical trial. That's right, of this drug. And are there other, that's obviously a big, in and of itself, a big constraint on many levels. But were there any other conditions that were placed on this? I also think, as I recall, that they have said that this national coverage decision applies to other drugs in this class that may be developed going forward.
Right. And let's, I think the hallmarks here is that drug was approved last year, right? The agency makes a bet that beta amyloid is a surrogate endpoint for clinical benefit, delaying progression of Alzheimer's disease, right? And so that signals to other sponsors. And in response, as you said, Ellie, CMS has promulgated a proposed decision that affects not just the approved product, but also ones in the pipeline, ones in the future that may have the same hallmarks, that are monoclonal antibodies, they're directed against beta amyloid, and they're for Alzheimer's. And so, this is a class-wide decision. Just for the notes, it came out into January 11th. It was a 30-day comment period, so it closed just before, Valentine's Day. And they expect to do the final by April 11th. I understand that they've received something order of 20,000 comments, which is historic. And I believe that they're still being put onto the public docket, so they become available for review as well. So so
it's so interesting to me, and I am speaking as somebody who doesn't have your level of expertise. It's so interesting to me that any concerns about the surrogate endpoint itself, the accelerated approval process, seems to me that would be worked out in the court of FDA, that another federal agent, this is just surprising to me that two federal agencies would be kind of trying to oversee each other. One of them was trying to oversee another one on this. It's very interesting. And the reason, I think one of the reasons Research America wanted to hold this Alliance member meeting and invite our friends from the community is just to raise awareness about what are the specifics here, because it does bear, regardless of what happens, it bears on the pace and nature of progress, medical progress, not just for Alzheimer's, for other diseases. And one other thing I'm going to say, and before we turn it to questions, and I'm sure we have plenty of them, is that this also really is important in the medical device arena. What we didn't have was time to cover both in a way that justifies both and is balanced, and all the things that we stand for as an alliance. And so, keep your eyes on invites for medical device specific, alliance member meetings. So with that, Anna, would you join us for questions?
Absolutely. And as a reminder to folks, please feel free to put your questions into the chat or the Q&A box, and we will do our best to ask them. So Paul, among the number of questions we've had come in thus far, could you touch on, maybe at a high level, the difference between drugs and devices in coverage decisions, as well as the role of real world evidence? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what's really interesting is, of course, under the FTC Act, the agency has different standards for determining whether drugs, biological products, and medical devices should go to market. So on the FDA side, there are differences. For Medicare purposes, CMS still has the magic language of reasonable and necessary with the criteria we talked about, including evidence of meaningful improvements in outcomes. That standard is, I wouldn't say unitary, but it is sort of a little more unified for CMS than it would be for the agency, for FDA in respect to drugs versus devices. So when you go in for a coverage question at the CMS, it may well be that somebody could request an NCD for you, even if you have no intention of seeking that. So that's again, thinking about transparency and the respective roles that payers, providers, patient groups, we can play. Anybody can throw, it's kind of the equivalent of a citizen petition in a way. Now, granted, CMS can always say no. In fact, they're more likely than not to say no, unless they feel like the hallmarks of this technology, this device, this diagnostic, what have you, really implicates the program and the fiscal nature of the program in a way that's important. And that's a dimension I think we didn't talk about, right? Which is like reasonable, necessary in the language we talked about in the deck does not encompass fiscal consequences for the program, right? Budgetary impact of coverage.
The budgetary impact.
But we know that they're made up of humans. They are thinking about the integrity of the program and the trust fund. So naturally, that is part of it. In a way, I think, culturally, right, somewhere in their bones, it is not the case at FDA, right? The FDA is driven to get biosims and generics to market. They do care about competitive issues. They have the Orange Book and the Purple Books out, but it isn't mission critical in the way that it is over right at the Medicare program. And I think that's a very important distinction.
Very, very difficult. And I will say that one thing I just want to throw in for folks is the national coverage decision, as Paul mentioned, if you get a national coverage decision, it prevents a lot of delays or the possibility of really different coverages around the country, coverage decisions around the country. The part that can be intimidating is if the national coverage decision really prevents access, then then it's access, those access barriers are across the country. But generally a national coverage decision creates equity for patients across the nation in coverage.
Thank you for that. And that's related to another question that has come in has anyone thought through or raised the idea of eliminating the regional CMS decisions so that every decision is national? You talked about, the lack of resources playing into that. Could you speak about that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Historically, Medicare, they've just deferred these coverage decisions to the regional contractors because, they're seeing the claims, they're a little bit closer to nap of earth to the ground, to seeing where these things emerge. But, again, it's a great question because the contractors were not structured, they're not charged with looking or evaluating clinical effectiveness or appropriateness of items. That's not their job, right? They're processing claims, but they've been pushed into this role by the same wavefront of innovation that the national CMS offices, and FDA has struggled with it. Ellie and I were just talking about how it's 30 years since the User Fee Act was enacted. It was enacted in part because there was this enormous wavefront of innovation coming through, and the agency needed the resources.
Lack of resources to.
Yeah, and I think to your point, Anna, to that questioner's point, neither CMS in Baltimore nor the regional contractors are equipped. And I will say, actually, and this sort of bridges over to the national proposed coverage decision we're talking about in relation to Alzheimer's. CMS asking for these clinical trials to be conducted for this class of monoclonals. We should bear in mind that they're looking for either approving the trials themselves or relying on NIH to conduct those trials, which means CMS doesn't have clinical staff either. They don't have neurologists, right? They don't have the same type of expertise that FDA incidentally does in the conduct of its review.
Right.
Not to disparage CMS, but to get to the point that the questionnaire is getting at, is that they don't have the clinical expertise to make this kind of decision point. So who is going to actually be making the evaluation at the end of the day? When the evidence, and it takes years to accumulate,
Yes.
Is it CMS, or are they going to be relying upon outside experts? I think that's a legitimate question.
And it's not a fault of CMS. We have the best of the best at CMS for what they have been charged with doing in terms of their work in all of the programs that they cover, the many programs that they cover. But do they actually have an FDA, a mini FDA over there? They do not.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you for that. So another question, Paul, in your opinion, how can Medicare Part B be expanded beyond drug product coverage to also include clinical services around the optimization of drugs covered in Parts B and D?
Wow.
Yeah, so this is great because, I'm going to dive into anecdote. I think the older you get, the more you think that anecdotes actually.
I love them because that just speaks to this. That's right.
You'll remember, so FDAMA, 1997. Remember, we were working on the user fee reauthorization. There were a lot of reform proposals, which really included like stripping authority out of the agency, right, to do drug reviews appropriately. But utilization questions were absolutely coming up because I think what was manifestly clear is that the agency only knew what was happening in the clinicals, and the open question was like, so there was a proposal for a rider that would have actually enfranchised federal payments for health service research through ARC of recently approved drugs. So it was almost like a model like CED, but bridging over to the agency's approval. It wasn't linked to expedited, right? But it was like ARC should take this money and do research on these new classes of drugs and look at it, not in a passive way, like from safety surveillance, but to actually conduct large trials. And, it was a big ticket item and nobody wanted to do it because it was, would it distract the agency and FDA? Would the agency be, there was one allegation, would the agency be laxer in its scrutiny of drugs?
Wow.
If we knew there was a more robust post-market mechanism for evaluating and developing the evidence. It's like interesting hypothetical, right? But the Part B side, I think, the real question goes back to what you were saying, Ellie, is like, is CMS being staffed up appropriately? Like there's the question of statutory authority, whether Part B can do that or not, and dive into assessing services and making evaluations of clinical services appropriately. But, again, at the end of the day, the agency just doesn't have the guns, right? And so they would need to contract, I think, for large scale cooperative research networks, right? To undertake this, maybe through specialty societies, and they have done that before, peer review organizations, et cetera, right? So it would be interesting to see, like, can we push CMS even further from being just a claims processor to someone who's actually developing the outcomes data that can better inform how the agency pays for stuff?
Well, I think that also, what I'm not sure if I'm reading this right. I think it might also be, could Part B be used to cover services themselves? And I've got to say, I'm so rusty on Part B, it's embarrassing. I'm thinking pharmacy management is what the question may be referring to. And I don't know what the coverage status is of things like managing drug utilization services around that.
Yeah.
Does Part B cover doesn't cover that today?
it'll cover clinical research, DME, right?
But I don't know that it covers the clinical services. We'll look into that for the person who is asking this question about, has there been any discussion around expanding Medicare Part B around services like the ones I think that you're referring to, and get back to you on that.
Yeah, I think I'm sure, like in terms of ambulatory services under Part B, it wouldn't cover something of that nature, and it would
Probably
be,
not, because that would be under home health or something like that, and Part A.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So another question, Paul, what is the role of the FDA's scientific advisory board in influencing decisions that they make?
So are we talking about the standing science board as opposed to the advisory committees, right?
This
I guess, yeah.
Yep. This person said FDA SAB.
Yeah.
So,
yes,
or Nancy,
yes.
please feel free to add to that.
Yeah. So the science board was, established to give the commissioner at a high level, I think it's like 24 experts who hopefully cover the range of regulatory science issues, at the agency. It's intended to help direct the agency's research agenda, and the agency has limited research funds, like to do stuff that they believe will help promote their pursuit of the mission, as well as training, right? And so they are not charged to look at issues in a product-specific way. So those submissions, those NDAs, those BLAs will go through the advisory committees, right? And that's the flow through the FACA process. And by the way, it takes the agency an enormous amounts of time and energy to staff up the advisory committees, right? That's a huge ongoing challenge for them to find the right members, not conflicted out, who can speak to these dossiers. So the science board has a limited charge, and they develop these strategic plans for the FDA science base, and that's kind of the role that they play. I think the risks of building that infrastructure out in that side of the house, so to speak, is that you attenuate the reliance on experts in-house at the review divisions, right? You've got and so if they speak with two voices, what does that say? I think that having them forward-leaning, looking in strategic directions, not in a product-specific way, but across the centers is a good thing, but it's by its nature limited.
Great, thank you for that. And keeping an eye on, I know we're close to our time, but another question, Paul. You mentioned Cures 2.0 earlier, and the Congress looking at accelerated approval processes and changes. Using your crystal ball, what changes do you think may happen there? What do you predict or foresee?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. Again, this is the pioneer expedited review pathway now, and one of the things people like Ellie and I have done over the years is created many new franchises. Fast Track was the first after that. Then a Breakthrough, RMAT, QIDP. I mean, you name it, right? And there always is another proposal to do that. And have you guys seen The Incredibles? Remember that Pixar movie? Where the villain says it's something like, "Well, if everybody's special, then nobody's special." Sorry. It's getting to the point where like those have real manifest demands on the agency's time and resources. Accelerated approval is not going to go anywhere and should not go anywhere because it is time tested. We mentioned 250 drugs and biologicals. There are institutional issues. There are issues on implementation, as there always are. And I think Dr. Pazder, for example, he's acknowledged a significant proportion, and there are conflicting estimates of those accelerated approval products have not completed their phase 4 confirmatory trials. That's just like, and there are reasons why that happens, right? You can't enroll or what have you, but there are those that remain on market without the substantial confirmatory trial, and they probably shouldn't be on market, right? Or that trials should have been done a different way because it's been like a decade.
Right.
So that's legitimate. There's also ones called dangling approvals, right? Where they absolutely haven't found conclusive confirmatory evidence. And that being the case, why is it still on market? That's also another legitimate question. But I think if you look at the totality of evidence of what has a pathway done for cancer patients, HIV patients, rare disease patients, it is overwhelmingly clear, in my personal opinion, that the pathway has done enormous good, and it has not weakened regulatory standards because
it's so important.
Yeah, and I think you can absolutely point out those flaws. You got it, but I believe by one estimate from the 90s, from the promulgation of the final rule to like 5 years ago, I think the literature says 3/4 of the approvals were converted to traditional approvals. And I think something
yeah.
on the order of maybe 10%, whether it's oncology or non-oncology accelerated approval, only about 10% were withdrawn, right? So, you know, just on those raw numbers, and again, I acknowledge that there's some ambiguity about them. That's a pretty good record, right?
No, and I want to just add in there that, you know, you don't, I think if the goal is about saving lives and reducing disabling symptoms, etc., you don't throw out a process that has some problems. You address those problems. And it goes to another really, I think, a really great question that came in that I'd love to quickly address, Paul, if you don't mind. And that is, you know, has accelerated approval proven itself relative to other ideas and issues or approaches like right to try? And one thing I would say to that is that, again, I don't think you should pit different ideas against each other. I think you should look at every idea with the notion of responsible, but, you know, as fast as possible progress. And back to what Paul was saying, the reason accelerated approval, and one of the main uses of accelerated approval originally, it was because patients took a stand and they said, we are not combating HIV AIDS fast enough. People are dying right now, every second of the day. And so this has been a stand-up moment for patients since it was initiated. And it's one of the reasons I think it's so important to talk about this pathway, talk about what CMS is doing, and, you know, just for patients to keep their eye on this, and along with the community as a whole. And boy, that's soapbox, man. I get up on it and don't even know it's happening. But I am so sorry that we've taken all of this time up, Paul, when we could have you for 4 hours on every question that has to do with FDA, CMS, and life in general. But I think I just have to say thank you, thank you, thank you. And will you come back? If we invite you back, will you come back,
yeah,
please?
absolutely.
Okay, then we're going to find many reasons. And I know there's some really important housekeeping that we need to do, and I'm going to turn that over to a person who is much better at it than me. So Anna?
Sure, happy to, Ellie. So just 2 quick announcements before everyone goes. First, Research America recently released a report detailing the growth of total U.S. investment in medical and health R&D. The report looks at 5 years of U.S. medical and health R&D investment by sector. So we hope you'll give it a read, and please feel free to share it widely with your networks. And there should be a link to the report being added to the chat. Secondly, on Wednesday, March 2nd at 1:15 p.m. Eastern, I hope you'll join us for another installment in our series highlighting 2022 Advocacy Awards honorees. On the 2nd, Dr. France Cordova, president of the Science Philanthropy Alliance, and Research America's 2022 Jeffrey Bean Foundation Builders of Science honoree, will speak with our CEO, Mary Woolley, about her tenure as director of the NSF, the role of private philanthropy and medical research, and much more. So please bring your questions and register via the link in the chat. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much, Paul, again for joining us, and have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks again, Paul.
Thank you.